I was in Edinburgh yesterday attending a conference organised by the International Magazine Centre called Magazine Street. And I wanted in this video to take the time mostly for myself, but you're welcome to listen and find it useful if you do, on some of the things that I heard there and what I've been reflecting and what I need to process about some of the things that the speakers said that I think can be useful in my own practice as well. I've grouped these broadly into three categories. First is the shortest, but it's quite important. It's on strategy. Before I dig into it, I'm mostly going to be talking about Killian Schulk's talk, which was about experimentation and using information and data to advance your business strategies for a magazine. But before I get into that, there was one particular line that he said that it will stick with me for a long time. I think he defined audience as being the people you're reaching out to, but he defined community as when they start talking to each other. Audience, people you're reaching out to, community when they start talking to each other. And I think that's, if nothing else, at least a very interesting thought exercise about how you distinguish, how you interact with both those parts of the people in and around your brand. But one of the things that I started thinking about a lot as Killian was talking was about this interplay between gut and about, between gut and data. You know, what is the problem is that if you only look at data, I think it's a sports metaphor and I'm bad with sports, and it's also a sort of tiresome MBA type phrase, but I think if you look at data from an existing audience, or even going out to try to attract a new audience, I think you'll be skating to where the puck is. But the best ice hockey, I presume, players skate to where the puck is going to be. It's the classic Henry Ford apocryphal line of, if I'd asked people what they'd wanted, they would have said a faster horse. I was also talking to Kieran O'Connor about the Week Junior and to Anna Bassi, the editorial director for that title. Something like the Week Junior is a hard title to pitch. Now, so if you don't know it, the Week is a brilliant magazine that comes out every week, and it's a digest of basically the week's news. It's a phenomenal title. It's doing very well. The Week Junior was launched only very recently, and comparatively in magazine terms, and it is, if I describe it as news round on paper, I'm probably going to offend somebody, but it's kind of the week's news presented for kids. And I think it's quite hard to data your way to a place where you can show that that's going to be a success. But I think at some point somebody just has to go, we're going to do this. I believe in this idea. We're going to do it. And there's a lot of discussion at Magazine Street about indie publishers and about, smaller one-person band projects, passion projects, and about what success can look like for them. I worry as well in that conversation about gut versus data. And obviously the answer is both, right? Let's take that as right. Obviously the answer is you need to sense check your gut against data. And if you're going to override the data, you better be damn sure or be prepared to suffer the consequences of being wrong. But there's also a thing about survivor bias, right? About I suspect that those people who are heavy proponents of editorial gut will choose to cite lots of examples at conferences about how they were right and the data was wrong, but they're only there at that conference because their idea succeeded where others didn't. And we tend to listen to those voices more. And the same is true the other way. Somebody who says, we researched this, we identified an audience this way, we looked at engagement metrics and we could see that this small change resulted in this big uplift. They also would similarly be able to tell you success stories, but again, they're the ones that get invited up to the stage to talk at conferences. I will say actually that Nikki Simpson, who's the director and founder of the International Magazine Centre, is very good at bringing together speakers and attendees to conferences which aren't, vacuous, vapid, bottom line type people who will sort of strut about on stage and tell you how great they are. The speakers were all quite cautious and thoughtful, quite vulnerable in many ways. I think that's quite valuable. But so that's my thing on strategy. But to link it into my next segment, which is on craft and magazine craft itself, there is a through line, because one of the quotes that I pulled out and wrote down was from Alex Longston, who's with his business partner created a magazine called Command Plus I, which is in some ways a photography magazine, because it is pages and pages of beautiful photography. But what they're also doing is pulling out color palettes from those photographs and suggest, partly for the exercise and the joy of it, but they're also saying, well, here's some color palettes. Do you want to use them? You can. And one of Alex's lines was, you can only realize how big an audience is for something once you put it into the world, and once the world has started to engage with it. Now, there's lots of counter arguments to that. If you don't market it well, get it to the right people, you will underestimate your audience. You could also have some very early successes that give you an overinflated idea of the audience size for that. You could have yes men around you telling you how great your idea is, and it might actually not be particularly sustainable. But I think there is something really true in that you can do all the research or not, but you can do all the research that you think, and you can begin, and it's a good way of benchmarking against your ultimate success, right? So it's not even about, I think 5,000 people will read this magazine and then 5,000 people do or don't. It's about that if 2,000 people do, you still think there's 3,000 people you haven't managed to reach, so let's do some work to reach them. If 10,000 people do, you go, I got something wrong, this is brilliant, let's all have some champagne. But the idea that, in particular, this section on craft that Alex put forward, and it's an incredibly simple idea, of course it is, but it's really worth in situations, and it's why I'm doing this exercise. I'm reflecting out loud. I'm reminding myself of what I've learned and reminding myself of what I think throughout my career. Alex used a line about a simple and small concept executed well, and I think there's huge value in that. I wear jeans made by a company based in Wales, and their slogan is "Do one thing well." They make really high quality, really, really nice jeans that last for a long time, and they repair them for you for free over and over again. And when I had a small child and I was kneeing about the floor all the time, some of my jeans have been back 3-4 times to be repaired, and they look fantastic, and they wear really well. And that, it can be, I don't want to over fetishize that kind of level of craft and of focus, because I think we can sometimes, underlying some of those projects and successes can be either quite privileged people who don't have to hustle and work and just churn out copy or pictures or work in a shop or whatever it is. But I think it's true that it's worth reminding yourself and taking a step to think about, is this new thing I'm thinking about doing going to materially improve everything that I'm doing, or it will materially improve my brand overall and my business overall and my life overall, or do I need to just refocus, double down, do one thing well? There was a line as well from Joanna Biggers, who has started a magazine called Dulcify Journal, which is a food and associated lifestyle title full of very beautiful photography and interesting stories. And she used a line, there's value in longer form still content. And that word still really resonated with me. I think that, especially as Joanna said, as we're surrounded by things that are very exciting and very interactive and shiny and glittery, there is definitely something to be said for media which is still. Books are obviously an example that people will reach for in this context. But I remember writing a thing for Peter Houston years and years and years ago about what the definition of a magazine was, and this was in the context of digital magazines becoming a thing. And one of the things I wrote were a mix of quite flippant, quite glib things, but then also quite, I think, important things. And one of the lines that really sticks with me is talking about a magazine as being finite. And I think there's something quite important about that. I'm not picking up magazines at the expense of all the media or anything like that. I think this idea of content that a billet of content, and I hate the word content, a unit of stuff, of experience, of information, of joy which can be consumed and finished. It's the antithesis of the constant scrolling on TikTok or Reddit or Twitter, and the infinite scroll of delight or terror in existential angst in what you're reading. There's something very nice about a magazine format that has X number of pages and it can be done. I think as humans, we quite like the experience of having completed something sometimes. She also made the point that in magazines, when she was trying to recruit advertisers into Dulcify Journal, she wanted to be quite selective about them, which there's a little voice in my head goes, well, we all want to be selective about advertisers, but there comes a point at which you just need money to continue to do the thing you're doing. But the point that she was making in particular, and of course we all kind of know this, but it took Joanna saying it for it to crystallize in my head. So often when she's reading magazines, she finds that the ads are often for products that are either way out of her price range or that have nothing to do with the magazine itself. That's really good. I think a lot of us have experience of reading magazines with ads for Range Rovers and Rolex watches and high-end fashion as ads. And that's very much part of the experience as well. I don't think there's, I think often we create too artificial a divide between editorial and advertising, because for a lot of us, especially in those lifestyle titles, engaging with the ads and seeing beautiful imagery is perhaps not as much a part of the experience as the editorial photography and copy, but it's certainly, we don't purely disdain it, right? We like seeing these things. So that was something that was quite important, I think. There was another line actually, talking about magazine craft, going back to Killian Schulk, who had a fantastic line when he was talking about the sort of things that publishers could do to experiment and drive their strategy forward. He said, oh, maybe this sounds like a lot of work. It's not a lot of work, it's a lot of thinking. That's a really good line, isn't it? It's not a lot of work, it is a lot of thinking. And I think we don't perhaps distinguish those two things enough. There are attempts, right? So people will have strategy days or away days or something to try and separate out the work from the thinking. And he's not talking there, I don't think, about the day-to-day business of producing a magazine. He's saying that if you want, in the context he was talking about, if you want to experiment in publishing, it might be that you think this is going to require a large investment in time to do the things, but it's not. Or it may not necessarily be, but what it is a way of, what it can be is something that requires you to take the 30,000-foot view, to pull back, perhaps to pull yourself physically away from a space where the day-to-day is done, and take a minute to think and pause and reflect, which is what I'm doing right now. I have no idea who's making it this far into this video, but it's not for you, it's for me. You might find it interesting, but it's for me to try and think about how I'm processing what I learned yesterday. The last segment, though, which is the most uplifting, and there's a lot of that yesterday, is about voice and about identity. One quick line from Laura Bartlett, who started a publishing company called House of Cocoa, produces a phenomenal travel title, acts as a platform for creators to bring them together and create almost a cooperative of creators working in this space. But she was talking, when she started early in publishing, she had a boss who, if Me Too had been a thing, would have been at the forefront of Me Too. And she just said, if he can have a magazine, so can I. That's a powerful and useful and valuable thing to think, I think. That realization that it's not meritocratic, is not the case that only good people or smart people or kind people or savvy people have those reins of power and communication and can make things that are interesting and beautiful and good. Anybody can. And that was an important thought. There was also a phenomenal line that really made me think from Fiona Hayes, who's an international art director, has worked variously for many Vogue editions, GQ and more. And there was a line she said that universities are really good at creating students who can respond very, very well to client briefs, but, and I'm paraphrasing her slightly here, perhaps they don't necessarily have the belief in, or indeed the articulation of, their own voice, their own beliefs. And her pitch was about, if you have a voice, great, what do you do with it now? And I think there's something in that. So I did a graphic design degree, and I can see reflected in my degree 20 years ago a little of what she's talking about. I'm not, and she's not ragging on the model or on universities per se, but I think that encouragement to think about consciously engaging with, is the thing I'm doing materially improving the world? If it's not, am I getting well paid for it, and is that enough recompense? I think, as I say, I'm always really, I think it's quite a middle class and quite an exclusionary position if what you're saying is everybody should be able to make impactful and meaningful work that is politically aligned with all of their beliefs, because I think we operate in a capitalist society, and those things aren't valued by capitalism. In fact, those things are often antithetical to capitalism. And see, I hadn't had this thought until I started talking out loud. And so I think it's reductive to say that we must only value work which is powerful and honest and authentic, because we all got bills to pay. But the flip of that is, I think she's right sometimes that we think too much about responding to briefs, articulating somebody else's voice, somebody else's message. And we could perhaps think a little bit more consciously about how we can advance our own. Rhiannon Davies was also a phenomenally powerful speaker. She has a magazine called Greater Govan Hill, which is a community title. Before going to her lines I picked out from what she said, I was reflecting afterwards with some former colleagues that one of the things that I found particularly powerful about Rhiannon's story and the story of the title she created is in direct response to what I've just been talking about, because Greater Govan Hill is created as a not-for-profit title. Any profits are reinvested back into the community and into the title. But I didn't ask this, I could be wrong. I suspect that Rhiannon's still taking a salary from the magazine. Perhaps not a big one. Perhaps it is a big one. It doesn't really matter. My point is, that's a way of doing something good and useful and important, but it's not just a plaything of somebody who can afford to do that. It is a sustainable business model if she is indeed taking a salary. I presume she is, because she talked a lot about trying to make sure she was paying writers who often refused, but that's their call. And so I think there is value in a not-for-profit model, which still ensures that the creators and the executive, if you like, around that title are also being paid in order that they can live. And can live authentically without. I keep skirting around. I keep wanting to say in my head, "Daddy's money," and I don't mean that in any way specifically for any of the creators I'm talking about here. But I hope you know what I mean when I'm thinking about that. It's that way of, and I'm not saying specifically one's father has given you money to do something, but I think there is often other economic forces which create an environment whereby certain types of people, often very middle class, often white, can be given a space in which to create things that are not commercially viable in and of themselves. And I kind of worry about that a little bit sometimes. Anyway, to Rhiannon's lines, she spoke about there being a need to face some uncomfortable truths about the way the media has been produced. Trust was very important to her, and I think she's right. And I think the media needs to reckon with itself on that. And I mean all media. We tend to think about the newspapers from the Murdoch press, or we tend to think about the Today programme, or Tertiary in The Guardian. But I think all media, fan media, indie media, everything has to constantly self-check and self-police and think about what it's doing and could it do better. I'm going to end though, actually not quite end, but there's one more line after this, but I'm going to end the main section talking about I think the line that resonates most with me from the whole day yesterday, which was Rhiannon's. And it was, there's no such thing as hard to reach, there's just badly served. And so often I think we do hear about people, areas of a society often underrepresented or marginalised. We talk about them being hard to reach. And Rhiannon's point, I think, is well made, well taken. They're not hard to reach. It's just no fucker is taking the time to serve that community well. And you got to put in the graph. You got to think about meeting them where they are. You got to, and again, this isn't about this consent. I mean, I'm middle class, right? And I'm white, and I'm cisgender, and I'm male. I've got almost every privilege in the sun going for me, and this can sound an awful lot like, oh, let's think about how we can talk to the poor people, or the dispossessed, or the brown people. You know, I think it can often shade into that if you're not careful, or at least the perception can shade into that. But I think an empowering and empathetic and enfranchising way of thinking about how we genuinely, properly reach out to and serve people who traditionally have been hard to reach in our society can be a very valuable thing to do. And so I thank Rhiannon, and indeed, of course, all the speakers for their time yesterday, and to Nikki for putting the conference together, and AV and everything else for making it all work. The last thing I wanted to mention, though, and it's a tiny, tiny thing, but for some reason it keeps sticking in my head as potentially the most important, was I was sitting in the audience and there was a gaggle of students, quite a lot of students there actually overall. There's a gaggle of students sitting behind me. And as the conference got underway, I think like as the round of applause was swelling between the master of ceremonies introducing the first speaker and the first speaker getting on stage, I think it was then, I heard one of them just whisper, "Wow, there's so many young people. It's amazing." There's so many young people. It's amazing. And isn't that important? I don't know why it seems so important to me, and I thought maybe it would come to me as I spoke about it, but it's not coming to me why that mattered so much. The student saw herself reflected. She felt that it wasn't a closed shop. She felt that people of her age were being seen and elevated and listened to, and they were in the room, right? They were in the room where it happens. They were a part of it and listen. And so there were industry grandees in the room, but they were there too. And maybe that's why that thing of, I see myself reflected here, and I perhaps feel like I've got a space at the table. I think perhaps if there's one or two students and the rest of it were all greybeards like me, then her experience of being there would have been different. She would have felt othered. She would have felt like she was there to listen, perhaps, and studiously take notes, rather than feeling that she was part of a community and part of a movement. Anyway, that struck me as important. This has run for, I can't see my timer, 20 odd minutes. But I think it's important. I don't think it's important for you to have listened to this or watched this, but I think it's important for me to have said it. And so if you have made it all the way here, I would encourage you, whatever you're doing today, tomorrow, the next day, if it's something, particularly if it's something strategic, but even if it's not, even if it's just been a regular old day of routine after routine after routine, I think there's value in explicitly taking time to sit down and physically articulate. You can do it in written form, you can do it in your head, but for me personally, at least, there's huge value in making noises with my mouth to work through stuff. There's a line I'm completely wedded to. How do I know what I think until I've heard what I say? And I think it behoves us all to take that time to process stuff and to make it make sense in our own heads, because it means that when we try to communicate these ideas to others, we have a clearer idea of why they're important. And I think that is important too.